Welcome to Huberman Lab Essentials, where we revisit past episodes for the most potent and actionable science-based tools for mental health, physical health, and performance. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. This podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero-cost-to-consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. Today we're going to talk about the science of tools for fat loss. Today's episode is mainly going to be focused on how the nervous system, neurons, and some of the cells they collaborate with, like glia and macrophages, encourage or can encourage accelerated fat loss, because it turns out they can. Remember, your nervous system, which includes your brain and your spinal cord and all the connections that they make with the organs of the body, governs everything. The nervous system, and the role of the brain and other neurons, has been vastly overlooked in the discussion about losing fat. Now, I would be remiss, and I'd probably come under a pretty considerable attack if I didn't just acknowledge upfront a core truth of metabolic science and also of neuroscience, frankly, which is that calories in versus calories out, meaning how many calories you ingest versus how many calories you burn, is the fundamental and most important formula in this business of fat loss and weight management in general. There's simply no way around the fact that if you ingest far more calories than you burn, you're likely to gain weight. A good portion of that weight is likely to be adipose tissue, fat. It's also true that if you ingest fewer calories than you burn, that you will lose weight and that a significant portion of that will come from body fat. What portion depends on a number of factors, but that simple formula is important. A calorie is a calorie as a unit of energy. We need to accept and acknowledge this calories in, meaning calories ingested versus calories burned formula. But the calories burned portion is strongly influenced by a number of things that you can control that can greatly accelerate or increase the amount of adipose tissue, or the proportion of adipose tissue that you burn in response to exercise and food. Today we're going to talk about the fact that your body fat, of various kinds, and there are several kinds of body fat, are actually innervated by neurons. Neurons connect to your body fat and can change the probability that that body fat will be burned or not. Your nervous system is the master controller of this process, and it plays a strong role in the calories out, the calories burned component. Let's talk about fat utilization. Let's talk about how fat is converted into energy, which is sometimes also called fat burning. There are two parts to this process. One is fat mobilization, and the second is fat oxidation, or utilization. That's a process called lipolysis. Fat cells can be visceral, around our viscera, our organs, or they can be subcutaneous, under our skin. Stored fat has two parts that are relevant here. It's got the fatty acid part, that's the part that your body can use, and that's attached to something called glycerol. They're linked by a backbone. To mobilize fat, you got to break the backbone between glycerol and these fatty acids, okay? That's accomplished by an enzyme called lipase, but you can forget all that if you want. Remember, we're just trying to mobilize fat. The first step is to get those fatty acids moving around in the bloodstream, to get them out of those fat cells, and then they can travel and be used for energy. They're going to go into cells that can use them for energy. Once they are inside those cells, they're still not burned up. You need to oxidize them. They need to be moved into the mitochondria, and then they can be converted into ATP, into energy. Just to really zoom out again, to make sure I don't lose anybody, you got to mobilize the fat, then you have to oxidize the fat. Many of the things that the nervous system can do is to increase the mobilization of fat, but also the oxidation of fat. What are these neurons that connect to fat doing? What are they releasing exactly? How do they actually increase fat mobilization? And how do they increase fat oxidation, burning of fat? Well, there are a couple of things that they release that encourage that process. The main one that you need to know about is epinephrine, or adrenaline. The conversion of these fatty acids into ATP in the mitochondria of cells is favored by adrenaline, okay? Adrenaline is released from two sources. Adrenaline is released from the adrenal glands, which sit atop our kidneys in our lower back. It's also released from the so-called sympathetic nervous system, although that name is a bit of a misnomer because it has nothing to do with sympathy. It has to do with stimulating alertness and promoting action of the body. It was thought for a long time that adrenaline swimming around in your body when you're fasted, because fasting can increase adrenaline, or when you're engaging in intense exercise, or when you're stressed, is going to promote fat oxidation. That's actually not the case. The adrenaline that stimulates fat oxidation, the burning of fat, is coming from neurons that actually connect to the fat. It's a local process. This is very important because it means that what you do, the specific patterns of movements and the specific environment you create that can stimulate these particular neurons to activate fat, meaning to release fat, to mobilize it, and then to burn it, is going to be a powerful lever that you can use in order to increase fat loss. Okay, so let's talk about how to activate the nervous system in ways that promote more liberation, movement, mobilization of fat, and more oxidation of fat. One of the most powerful ways to stimulate epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, from these neurons is through movement. The type of movement that I'm referring to is extremely subtle. Shivering is a strong stimulus for the release of adrenaline, epinephrine, into fat and the increase in fat oxidation and mobilization. There are other subtle forms of movement that can greatly increase fat metabolism and fat loss. There was a group in England during the 1960s and 70s that discovered a pathway by which subtle forms of movement can greatly increase fat loss. This is the work of Rothwell and Stock. It's very famous in the thermogenesis literature. I learned about this early on when I was an undergraduate. I asked, how did they come across this? Here's how the story goes. They were aware that some people overeat and yet don't put on weight. Other people overeat even just a little bit, and they seem to accumulate extra adipose tissue. Now, this is long before all the discussions about microbiome and hormone factors. It was long before many of the hormone factors, besides insulin, had even been discovered. What they did was they examined people who overate and did not gain weight. What they observed was that those people engaged in lots of subtle movement throughout the day. In other words, they were fidgeters. That's what they called them. In 2015 and again in 2017, there have been studies that have explored this using some modern metabolic tracking. Indeed, simply moving a lot, being a fidgeter, bouncing your knee, standing up and pacing several times or many times throughout the day, led to considerable amounts of fat loss and weight loss when people were ingesting the same amount of food. If they overate, they were able to compensate and burn off that food. For people that are overweight, who are averse to exercise, fidgeting might actually be a good entry point. Now, that's great. You can think about the protocols, but I want to nest that protocol in what I said before, which is that fat is controlled by these neurons and the epinephrine they release. Those subtle movements of our core musculature, not just the core, but all our limbs and our musculature, those low-level movements, they trigger epinephrine release from these neurons. They stimulate the mobilization of fat, and then that fat is oxidized at higher rates. What's the protocol? Fidget. If you're really interested in burning calories and you already exercise, you want to burn more, or you don't have the opportunity to exercise, or you're averse to exercise for whatever reason, fidgeting movements, staccato movements, standing up, walking around, pacing, all the sort of nervous activities that we're so critical of in other people and sometimes in ourselves are actually mobilizing and oxidizing a lot of fat and a lot of energy. While this probably won't compensate for chronic overeating, the caloric burn from this is considerable and very likely can offset a meal that had excessive calories or a steady state of eating too much. Now it should make sense why shivering is one of the strongest stimuli that one can incorporate to stimulate fat loss. Now, shivering is almost always associated with cold. We think shivering, we think cold, because when we get cold, we shiver. There are two ways that shivering can increase fat loss. There are several ways that you can use shivering. You can leverage shivering, and you can leverage cold to accelerate fat loss, but you have to do it correctly. Most of the people that are using cold, and frankly suggesting cold as a means to increase metabolism and fat loss, are suggesting the exact wrong protocol. Most people out there are using cold exposure, typically by taking cold showers or by getting into cold water of some other kind, a lake or a river or a cold bath or an ice bath. Since today we're talking about accelerating fat loss through the use of science-based tools, I want to emphasize a study that was published in Nature just a couple of years ago, showing exactly how cold increases metabolism and fat loss. We have several kinds of fat, 3 kinds in fact. We have white fat, white adipose tissue, and we have brown fat, or brown adipose tissue. There's a third kind, which is beige adipose tissue. White fat is the type that we traditionally think of as fat, subcutaneous fat. It is not particularly rich in mitochondria. It is there as an energy storage site. We have to mobilize the fat out, as we talked about before, and burn it up elsewhere. Brown fat largely exists between our shoulder blades and on the back of our neck, between the scapulae. It's rich with mitochondria, which is why it's called brown fat. Brown fat has a particular biochemical cascade, whereby it can take food energy and break it down and convert it into energy within those cells. Unlike fatty acids from white fat, which have to travel elsewhere, get broken down in mitochondria, and be converted into ATP, brown fat is thermogenic. It can actually use energy directly. Cold causes the release of adrenaline from your adrenals, and it causes the release of epinephrine from these neurons that connect to fat. The paper published in Nature shows that it is shivering itself that causes the brown fat to increase your burn rate, and your metabolism. It works like this. When you get into cold and you shiver, the shivering, that low-level movement of the muscle, those small movements, triggers the release of a molecule called succinate. S-U-C-C-I-N-A-T-E. Succinate. Succinate acts on the brown fat to increase brown fat thermogenesis and fat burning overall. The question then is, how long to get into that cold environment, and how cold should that environment be? First, let's talk about how long to get into that cold environment. It turns out that if you want to trigger the shiver, what you want to do is to get into the cold, then get out of the cold and typically not dry off, and then get back into the cold and out of the cold. That will definitely stimulate more shivering than just getting into the cold itself. How cold should it be? Look, if you get into water that's very, very cold, it can actually shock your heart. It can actually give you a heart attack if it's truly, truly ice cold and you're not adapted to that. Proceed with caution, please. I'm not a physician, and I don't want to see anyone get hurt. Just cold enough to be uncomfortable is a good place to start. For some of you, that's going to be 60 degrees. For some of you, that's going to be 55 degrees. For some of you, it's going to be high 30s, right? It depends on how cold adapted you are. What you need to do is find a temperature that you can get into 1 to 5, probably 1 to 3, times a week if you really want this to accelerate fat loss. You want to get in until you just start to shiver, and then you want to get out and not dry off. Wait anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, and then get back into the cold. Here's a potential sets-reps protocol that you can play with. Find a temperature that induces shiver for you. That's going to vary depending on your cold tolerance and how cold adapted you are. 1 to 3, maybe 5 times a week. Get in or get under the shower or whatever it is until you start to shiver, genuinely shiver. Then, after about a minute or so, get out. Spend 1 to 3 minutes out, but don't dry off. Get back in for anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, but try and access the shiver point again. You might do 3 repetitions of that. It's 3 times in and 3 times out total. Next, I'd like to move to exercise and how particular timing and types of exercise can vastly improve fat loss. The topic of exercise is a controversial one. I think the most simple way, the most fluid way to have this conversation about exercise and fat loss is in terms of 3 general types of training. Those are high-intensity interval training, so-called HIIT, H-I-I-T, sprint interval training, which is very high intensity, or SIT, and moderate intensity continuous training, MICT. We've got HIIT, SIT, and MICT. If you'd like to map this to VO2 max, SIT is defined as all out, greater than 100% of VO2 max bursts of activity that last 8 to 30 seconds, interspersed with less intense recovery periods. This would be sprinting downfield for 8 to 30 seconds, then maybe walking back for about a minute or two, and then sprinting again, and then continuing. HIIT is defined as submaximal, So 80% to 100% of VO2 max bursts of activity that last 60 to 240 seconds, interspersed with less intense recovery periods. MICT is steady-state cardio, sometimes called Zone 2 cardio these days on the internet, which is performed continuously for 20 to 60 minutes at moderate intensity of 40% to 60% of VO2 max. If you prefer heart rate, that's 55% to 70% of max heart rate. We can think about high, medium, and low-intensity exercise, although low intensity usually means that you could carry on a conversation, or maybe you have to gasp every few steps or so while trying to talk and run. Let's ask the question that I think many people are wondering about, which is it better, meaning, do you burn more fat, if you do your exercise fasted? Fasted, in this respect, could be that you wake up in the morning, you've been fasting all night, you just hydrate, and you exercise. For short periods of training, it doesn't really seem to matter whether or not you eat before training or you don't if your goal is fat oxidation. At a period of about 90 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, there's a switchover point whereby if you ate before the exercise, you will burn far less fat from the 90-minute point onward than you would if you had gone into the training fasted. Now, there are also studies that point to the fact that you don't have to wait to 90 minutes in order to get this enhanced fat-burning effect. If one does high-intensity training, or even very high-intensity forms of training like sprints or squats or deadlifts, or any kind of activity that can't be maintained for more than 8 up to 60 seconds, then the switchover point at which you can burn more fat if you go into that fasted comes earlier. This makes sense because there's nothing holy about the 90-minute point for medium-intensity Zone 2 cardio. That 90-minute point is when the body shifts over from mainly burning glycogen, basically sugar that comes from muscles or the liver, and realizes, this is going on for a while. I'm going to shift over to a storage site fuel that is in reserve, like body fat. This is something that has to do with the milieu of various hormones. What has to happen is insulin has to go down far enough. If you ate before the exercise, you'd have an increase in insulin. If you ate carbohydrates, you'd have a bigger increase in insulin. Fat and proteins will have lower amounts of insulin, and fasting will give you the lowest amount of insulin. If you think about it, if you were to do something high intensity for 20, 30, or 40 minutes, maybe lift weights, and then get into Zone 2 cardio, if you were fasted, the literature says that you're going to burn more body fat per unit time than if you had eaten before or during the exercise. What does this mean? This means that if you want to burn more body fat, exercise intensely for 20 to 60 minutes, and then move over into Zone 2 cardio. If you do that fasted, then indeed you will burn a higher percentage of body fat. If you can't even get to the exercise, if you're somebody who just can't do the training at all, then obviously eating something makes the most sense. In general, the theme is very simple. You want insulin levels to be pretty low if your goal is body fat reduction. This could be distilled into a simple protocol whereby 3 or 4 times a week, you do high-intensity training followed by either nothing or low-intensity training, especially if you're able to do that fasted. What we're talking about today is how to optimize body fat loss. Again, it has to do with the neurons and how we engage the nervous system. Adrenaline, aka epinephrine, is really the final common path by which movement of any kind leads to fat loss. It's the trigger and the effector. Now, I want to turn our attention to compounds that increase epinephrine and adrenaline, as well as compounds that work outside that pathway to increase fat loss. One of the more common ones is caffeine. It can be effective at dosages up to 400 milligrams. If you like caffeine and can use it safely, ingesting somewhere between 100 and 400 milligrams of caffeine 30 to 40 minutes before exercise can be beneficial for fat oxidation. Another is GLP-1, which can be increased by ingesting yerba mate. This shifts metabolism toward enhanced fat burning. There are also pharmaceuticals like semaglutide, which act on the GLP-1 pathway, but these require a prescription. Compounds like berberine or metformin can reduce blood glucose and insulin, thereby increasing fat oxidation. From a diet perspective, adherence is key. Different diets can all work if they create a caloric deficit. However, keeping insulin low can help increase fat oxidation. Once again, we've covered an enormous amount of material. We've talked about the science of fat loss, especially from the perspective of the nervous system, epinephrine, and movement. We discussed NEAT, fidgeting, shivering, cold exposure, exercise intensity, fasted training, and compounds like caffeine and GLP-1 related tools. Last but not least, I want to thank you for your time and attention today. Thank you for your interest in science, music,